Thank you all for joining us for another special edition of the American Mind podcast. I'm going to talk today with Matt Spalding and Charles Kesler about the 1776 Commission and its report, which, as you'll hear on this podcast, was summarily nixed by the Biden administration on the first possible day that they could. We talk about the report, about its roots in American principles and American justice, the challenge of identity politics, populism and its relation to America, and all sorts of wide-ranging conversation about this important work, including the continuing work that the commission is going to do, even though it's not officially together anymore under the leadership of Matt Spalding from his perch in Washington, D.C., where he runs Hillsdale College's Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. Just the formal titles for everybody. Matt Spalding is the Kirby Professor in Constitutional Government at Hillsdale College, and he's the Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at their Washington, D.C. campus, as I mentioned, and he's Vice President for Washington Operations. Charles Kesler, my colleague at the Claremont Institute, Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute, the Dengler-Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, and of course, the editor of the Claremont Review of Books. So I hope you all enjoy this. Thanks for listening. Welcome, Charles Kesler and Matthew Spalding, to a special edition of the American Mind podcast. We wanted to talk about the 1776 Commission and its report. Matt, you were the executive director of it. Our friend and colleague, both at Claremont and at Hillsdale, Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale, vice chairman here at the Claremont Institute, was the chair of the commission. Charles Kesler served as a member of the commission. And if we could just start, Matt, if you just give us a little bit of the history of this commission, why it came about, this document that it produced, and then the swift reaction to the document with the with the assent of the Biden administration.
The rise and fall.
Yeah.
Well, just I guess a short thumbnail. The setting aside where the idea of the commission kind of really came up publicly for the first time on the anniversary of the Constitution. So September of last year, it's mentioned there's a White House conference on American history. It's soon thereafter that they write it up in an executive order, which I believe is early November, to create the commission. They immediately started trying to figure out what the heck to do. I took leave from Hillsdale College. I had to formally take leave to run the commission at the beginning of December, and we started trying to convince people like Charles Kesler to serve on the commission. And the commission, I believe, first met, I believe it was December 14th, if I'm not mistaken, to discuss what it was doing and its plans. It met again on December. The first meeting was earlier, and it met on the 14th or 15th to approve a report that came out on the 18th. Martin Luther King Day, that Monday. The report came out later in the day. There was actually it had to be formally submitted to the president and get up on the White House website. So that was on Monday, Tuesday, actually late Monday night. And into Tuesday, we have heard that the commission will be abolished in one of the first executive orders of the new administration. Mm-hmm. That was signed sometime after noon on Inauguration Day. And of course, at noon on Inauguration Day, the website was flipped and the report was taken down from the website. And the commission was officially abolished in an executive order on expanding equity in the federal government.
Yeah. So a brief and brilliant career.
A very brief and intense career, which of course for me was actually somewhat enjoyable, since I could take my leave, and now that I've been fired, I am back gainfully employed by Hillsdale College.
You finished your federal service.
I have finished my service. I have served my country.
Now, to give you an example of how brief the tenure of this commission was, Ryan. I received my scroll of appointment. You know, if you get one of these positions in the federal government, they send you in a cylinder a sort of embossed scroll describing the job you're appointed to, and it's, you know, signed or machine signed really by, of course, the president. And my scroll arrived, I guess on the 19th, the day before inauguration, and it says there, you know, my term is 2 years, and the very next day I was unappointed and the commission was abolished. Yeah. So I had the scroll in my hands for less than 24 hours before the commission was unceremoniously dismissed.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I picked up the last commissions on the Friday after the inauguration. And there was a part of me, because the commissions have to be signed by the president. They're actually signatures, Charles. So you now have a collector's item.
Is that right?
They're actually they have to be signed by the president, and then they go to the State Department, and they have to be signed by the Secretary of State. So in this case, Michael Pompeo. So on the Friday after the inaugural, I had to pick up the last 6 of these commissions. And there was a part of me that was hoping that this would be a Marbury versus Madison moment. They would refuse the commissions, and we would have a court case.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, they actually did give them to me. Probably wanted to get rid of them. But I was picking up commissions after the commission was actually abolished. So, but yeah, it did meet. Its first meeting was on the 18th of December. Its last meeting was on the 15th of December. It was released on the 18th of December.
January. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about this equity executive order, and we're going to talk a little more comprehensively about the liberal response in the New York Times and elsewhere to sections of the report. But this story of its reception initially and then its quick abolishment is interesting. And it gets to, I think, the heart of the division in some ways between left and right in America today. The CNN headline I remember was something like Trump's 1776 Commission releases racist report on U.S. education on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I think the crux of the disagreement, which is captured in the other parts of that executive order on equity and inclusion from the Biden administration, is, I think, one of the, not a leitmotif, but a really core of this report. And it's a core of how we at Claremont and Hillsdale understand the American way of life and the American government and its legitimizing sources, is that individual equal natural rights are the source of the legitimacy of our politics. They're announced in the Declaration of Independence. They're safeguarded at the beginning, of course, imperfectly in the Constitution. And our story in many ways has been the attempt to bring practice in line with principle, with equal natural individual rights at the core of this. But the left these days, and for many decades, has taken a very different view of rights. And I think that's where the rub is. And I think the layman reading this and reading the response to it would miss a lot of that, because, you know, one of the more powerfully charged terms in American politics today is racist, to be called a racist. And it's a cudgel that the left uses often, and they used it here, whereas we would argue, in fact, the 1776 report and the spirit of the commission is really the original anti-racist Americanism that we study and celebrate.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, well, first of all, I was pretty sure they were going to not like the report. I kind of saw that coming. Having said that, I think it clearly struck a nerve, a deeper nerve than perhaps we anticipated. Because lo and behold, what was happening, there were two things going on simultaneously, the same track, which was we were producing this report over the 5 or 6 weeks that I was, started working on it on leave. Well, but simultaneously, there were people clearly working on executive orders to be issued on the first day of the new administration. So these things were going on. So, on the one hand, I was kind of shocked that a president would abolish the 1776 commission. And this was written to advise one president, but clearly intended to advise that president or a future president for that matter. There's really nothing controversial here. But I think the two things that necessitated its abolishment and removing the report, one, as you alluded to, it came out on Martin Luther King Day. That's not merely a coincidence. The report is written and has a touchstone back to the principles of 1776, but also points out that really every major reform movement in American history, the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the early civil rights movement, in particular Martin Luther King, look back to the Declaration of Independence. That was the promissory note. And so we argued that the proper understanding of the principles of 1776 that is equality encompassed all of that. So that was one problem. But I think that they wanted to go, not only did they dislike that argument being made, but this executive order on equity, they're wanting to go in opposite direction, really demanded that they destroy that argument, that they repudiate it, that they not allow it to see the light of day, that there would be no discussion about these alternative ways of looking at civil rights, which of course has the effect of underscoring precisely one of the claims in the appendix on identity politics, which is there's no room for conversation. It's kind of closed when it comes to that thing. You don't look back to the idea of permanent principles to guide us, right? It's about current a current view of how oppressors and oppressed needs to be corrected by current government action. Well, it turns out when you read that Biden executive order on equity, that's precisely what they wanted to do and where they wanted to go. Mm-hmm. So the 1776 Commission is replaced by an equitable data working group, which will do what? It's going to categorize Americans by their race and color and ethnicity. These are really diametrically opposed things across the board. So I would say both at the philosophical level of the principles and how we understand them, but also the practical level of application. These things are really at odds. And I think that the abolition of the commission and what is going on, it really underscores all that. And it shows you this really is the cross section, if you will, of much of the debate currently about at the center of American politics.
Yeah. The sort
Charles, you agree with that, or are you?
I was struck by the what the president said in his inaugural address. Where he suggested that the American people ought to open their soul and to try a little tolerance and humility instead of just fighting this uncivil war. He said in this rather unfortunate term, an uncivil war between red and blue. But then his own example of humility was to compare himself to Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. But if you think about the parallel, so what did Joe Biden sign that day? He signed a series of executive orders, including the order abolishing the 1776 Commission, which by analogy, he seems to think these were as important as the Emancipation Proclamation being signed by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, when he signed it back in 1863, said, "My whole soul is in this." And Biden, in his inaugural address, says more or less, "Me too. My whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, uniting our nation, and dismissing the 1776 Commission."
Yeah.
So there's of course, any president who in his first day on the job compares himself to Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation has got some, has used up a lot of rhetorical room and has got a long way to go now to just demonstrate that tolerance and humility that he recommended to the American people.
Yeah, I was struck by how one should read this inaugural side by side with Jefferson's first inaugural. Mm-hmm. And now he had won this decisive victory against his arch enemies, which an election was full of lots of vitriol, to say the least. Yet he had a different understanding of the relationship between majority and minority. And it was actually a call for unity. I just read it the other night. It talks about unity, but the unity is to be found in these principles we have in common.
Right.
The other thing I probably very few people notice this, which I think again goes back to why this had to happen, is in his inaugural he talks about the great crises we face. Of course, one of them is the COVID and the survival of the planet because of the environment. But one of them is a cry for racial justice some 400 years in the making. That is an allusion to 1619.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's well, you get a sense of the kind of unity that Biden is talking about, and Charles knows better than I. He's written a whole book on it in a way. But this was a common rhetorical trick of Obama's, and he was more skilled at it than Biden, of implying that the new unity is really on his terms. That's clear from the executive order alongside Biden's inaugural, Charles. It's clear what kind of unity he's talking about. Unity around his understanding and his party's understanding of American principles and justice, which is, as we've laid out in brief and comes across in the report, is diametrically opposed to an older understanding. And that's hence our deep divisions and superheated national political scene.
Yeah. No, I think it's, obviously he sees himself as, in a way, a kind of continuation of the Obama term, or the two terms of Obama. This is like the third act of the Obama progressive era. But he, and indeed, in the speech he gave Saturday night, I guess, after the election, the week of the election, he quoted Obama, or paraphrased Obama, from his 2004 DNC convention address, in which he said, we're not the red states and the blue states, we're the United States of America. So Biden is trolling in those same waters. And he wants, just like Obama wants, to do something bold, without using the term audacious. Or he talked about being bold in his inaugural address, but also doing something that would unify the country. And I think that's fundamentally a political miscalculation. There's not going to be a lot of political unity in the country now or in the near future, unless something very dramatic happens, unless there's some kind of external shock that changes the terms of our debates. The only thing we can actually try to achieve, it seems to me, is some moderation. We are not going to have unity. And one part of the strange analysis that Biden gives you in the inaugural address is unity is not only the destination, like a far distant place we're going to end up somehow, but unity is the way forward. I mean, so unity is both the means and the end. So everything depends upon being able to unify the two parties. The two parties are not going to be unified anytime soon. He's setting himself up to fail. He's setting himself up to have a very difficult administration. And one could say that he missed an opportunity, maybe, to try to achieve something he might be able to achieve, which is to turn the dial down from 11 to 8 in terms of the partisan claims that his party and the other party are making against each other. That would be an achievement if you could just do that. And step back a little bit from the speakers that are blaring. That would be an achievement. But to get to unity when you have fundamental disagreements is not going to be possible. And the fact of fundamental disagreements, I think, is the thing which the Democratic Party, both its Obama and its Biden phase, really has trouble believing. I mean, to the extent that they would like to think that Trump's problem was he had a different set of facts, that he's unreal. He doesn't recognize the world as it is, and he believes he could invent facts. And so they go on a great deal about science and facts, that we need to just, if we could all agree on the facts, our politics would be unified. Mm-hmm. But that just isn't true. I mean, it's what is happening here is not just a disagreement about facts. It's a disagreement about values. It's understandings of justice and of the common good, which are increasingly discrepant between the two parties. That's the crisis of the country. And you're never going to unify those by saying, be unified. Right. You're going to have to, work to gain the confidence of the other party and its voters moving forward.
So Charles, that's actually that's well said. So here's kind of I guess partially a question for you, right? Isn't and I'm struck by the Jefferson parallel I mentioned earlier. I've actually been teaching that of late. And his call for unity actually is a call for moderation. That is, calls for unity are calls of moderation. Yeah. And you moderate because you try to think about what are the things we have in common.
Right.
And that has the effect of moderating. The other thing he says there, and this is what I want to draw you out on, is not every, if I get my quote right, not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. Right. But part of the problem today, of course, is that our differences of opinion are increasingly differences of principle.
Right.
And how do you proceed on that? Well, I mean, part of that would be to at least moderate those differences of principle under, say, the rule of law and our agreement that the legal process that we have, the framework of legal process we have set up is to help us to figure these. I think there is an argument to be there for unity, right? One could make that argument. I don't think we're at the point where we can never be unified again. But the question is, what do we mean by unity? If unity means conformity to my political agenda, I agree that ain't going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah,
but there's an argument for unity to be had, it seems to me.
Well, no, I agree with that as far as it goes. I mean, but the problem is there's no unity of principle. I mean, if you could say, look, we disagree about the extent of states' rights as between, say, the Jeffersonians and the Federalist Party back in 1800. But we agree on the nature of human rights. We agree on the purpose of government being to protect those rights. And we agree even on the general notion of limited government. Government is not there to totally shape your life and to turn you into a holy a person. There are limits to the earthly powers of the government and its ambitions. If they could agree on all of that, then sure, they can disagree about whose commissions should be delivered and when, exactly what the foreign policy of the country ought to be towards France and so forth. You could work those things out. But as you rightly say, increasingly every question of opinion is linked to a question of principle, and on the ultimate principles, there's a lot of disagreement. So. This is, my metaphor of this is the two constitutions. When you have two constitutions,
that's a good title for a book.
Yes,
you should think about that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Get it at your local bookseller.
Quick plug for Charles Kesler's "Crisis of the Two Constitutions," out from Encounter Books. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Well, I have to go now. My work is done. But it's tough. And so I make the argument, not in the book, actually, but in the next issue of the CRB, that, it used to be said we could disagree on a lot of things so long as we agree on the nature of personal rights, civil rights and elections. But we really disagree both about the nature of rights and what an election ought to do. And 2020, in a way, sort of showed you how far apart we're getting. We really have two different views of what an election ought to be, informed by two different views of justice about what rights ought to be. And so it's hard to compromise, on why didn't Biden call for a national commission of inquiry to look into the 2020 elections and issue as far as possible, objective report about what happened, what went wrong, what didn't go wrong, and let us then deliberate, as a country about how we want to conduct our elections going forward. But I think the reason is because there really is a difference it's not just that Democrats obviously want to have rules that allow them to elect Democrats easily, and Republicans want rules that encourage the election of Republicans. That's always true of the parties. But the difference really is that the one party now thinks of the election as the collection of individual acts of consent. And the other party, the Democratic Party, increasingly thinks of the election as a way to collect the group votes, the block votes of the groups that constitute the modern American polity. And if voters don't show up in person, if they don't sign exactly where they're supposed to sign on the affidavit or date it the way they're supposed to date it, that doesn't really matter, because it doesn't matter that this individual has voted.
Right.
The question is, this representative of the Black vote or the Hispanic vote or the LGBTQ vote has registered his group's preferences.
They have what we like to call virtual representation.
Yeah, it's basically a form of virtual representation, or presumptive representation. We don't need to really know the identity of the voter. We need only to know the type of the voter.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to, it isn't quite as stark as that, but I think that's the stark difference underlying a lot of the debate. Because it's one party really does think that showing an ID at the point of voting is racist. That's the argument. That's the state of the argument, that there's a kind of fundamental injustice if you challenge the identity of any voter who is representing an underrepresented block of voters.
Yeah.
That's lèse majesté, as it were.
Right.
Yeah, and the objective claim to that being fair and just from the other side, from the left, is that if you ask those groups for IDs, they turn out in fewer numbers, so their group is less represented, so that it's the disparate impact theory. Yeah. One thing that struck a nerve I saw in the New York Times and elsewhere was, and it's tied to this notion of group rights versus individual rights, was in the report, John C. Calhoun was called the leading forerunner of identity politics. There's nothing to get post 60s liberals howling than being compared to John C. Calhoun. But what do we mean by that? Calhoun, of course, was the great defender of the institution of slavery, the expositor of a notion of American constitutionalism with a group veto at its center, writing in the 1820s and 1830s, and really was the leading intellectual of the pro-slavery South. So I understand why liberals would be mad about that comparison, but what did you mean by that, Matt?
Well, I think your points are well taken, and one thing I might point out is we're about to release a edition of the report with footnotes. It'll have nice little footnotes to all these things that the professional historians would like us to footnote.
Right.
This is a powerful argument here, and I think that the report is actually on very firm ground on this one, which is, the report broadly takes the position. Look, we need to be very forward and upfront and accurate and honest about history. So it talks about slavery, and it talks about how the founders understood it, how Lincoln understood the founders, what happened at the Constitutional Convention. But then it notes that the pro-slavery argument wasn't the founders themselves. It really comes up later. In particular, it comes out of this fellow, John C. Calhoun. And John C. Calhoun never doubted the founders thought that all men are created equal. And he understood that he had to attack it because of that. And so he attacks the Declaration in order to defend slavery. Slavery is a positive good, as you said. And he invents in his work Disquisition on Government the argument that the ground for this is that that the idea of individual rights grounded in nature is not true. It's actually a great error, he says. We need to look at this differently. We must understand people as groups, and there are different groups. And some groups are more advanced than others. They've evolved differently. They have different backgrounds, and thus they should rule or be ruled. And in his case, the white race, they developed in his context, had the right to rule the black race and enslave them. Well, that's identity politics. That's the first statement of identity politics. The idea that different groups have rights according to their ethnicity or group identity. That's the beginning of the argument. And the report kind of takes that as an attack on the principles of the Declaration. In the same way, it sees the progressives as an attack on the principles of the Declaration, because it also denied that all men are created equal for more relativistic reasons, but also in line with their claims about history. And we really do see the modern turn away from Martin Luther King's understanding of civil rights towards more radical aspects of that, and the revival of this thing called identity politics, which grows out of critical race theory and things like that. Okay, it's a different form. It's nowhere near as barbaric as slavery. That's not the claim here. But intellectually, it's a rejection that rights are grounded in equal human nature, and that we all possess them equally, regardless of race or gender or sex or anything. And they reject that. And when you reject that, you got to go in a different direction. Well, what's the direction? Well, you identify rights and benefits and one's status in society based on one's group and based on artificial things like race and gender and sex. Well, that's a clear divide, and we think that's problematic. And we point out that we don't know where this is going ultimately, but when we've gone down this road before, it's really never worked out very well. But intellectually, yeah, modern identity politics has a certain intellectual parallel with John C. Calhoun and the argument which at the time was used to defend slavery, which again, that makes us nervous as well, that these are not stable arguments, right? So one group today might have rights, and the same group tomorrow might not have rights. That doesn't strike us as very good ground upon which to defend the rights of all either. So I think the report was absolutely right on calling that out. And you're right. I think that also struck a nerve, which say we put the modern identity politics not on the side of Martin Luther King and Lincoln and the founders, but on the side of among others, John C. Calhoun in this argument for group rights.
Yeah, there was some indignancy too in a couple of clips from the critical New York Times pieces. Shocking, I know, but people, I think the analog to your argument is that people were indignant at the quote unquote appropriation of black leaders like Frederick Douglass to the cause of 1776. And our claim and your claim, the Commission's claim and Claremont's claim and Hillsdale's claim is that this older tradition of anti-slavery Americanism and pro-civil rights Americanism shared with the founders this notion of individual natural rights, and that is it's hostile to the current notion of group rights, which is ascendant on the left. And they can be indignant about it, but it's just true.
Well, look at the 1619 Commission. There's nothing about Frederick Douglass or abolitionism, except there is something about black abolitionism, but not about the many white people who also were fervid abolitionists, driven by the very principles of 1776, among other principles, that the 1619 Commission is questioning.
And here, just to point out, Frederick Douglass in many ways is the perfect one to study. Yeah. Because you recall Frederick Douglass himself, of course, is a slave who escapes. He initially condemns the Constitution, following Garrison and some of the abolitionists who were critical of the Constitution. But what does he set out to do? He studies it. He studies the history. He reads about the Revolution. He reads about the Constitutional Convention. And he comes to the conclusion that indeed the Constitution is this glorious freedom document And it's a glorious freedom document because behind it is the Declaration of Independence, which is the ring bolt, he calls it, of your nation's history, of your liberty. So it's a great example of someone who begins at one point, which perhaps more contemporary historians might like that position, but he actually goes back and tries to study the accurate history of it and comes to a different conclusion.
Yeah. But he didn't have a PhD in history, Matt. So
he wasn't a professional historian. Yes, that is a problem. I'm not sure he footnoted his writings either.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. That's one of the criticisms, that there were no historians on this commission. It's as you made fun of rightly, Matt. There's no footnotes in it, but you all are going to expand.
Of course, Victor Davis Hanson is a classic historian,
right?
But of course, I guess classic doesn't matter anymore,
right? Yeah.
He's also a military historian. That's we can't have that.
Those the dudes he studies are too old and too white, Matt. So the criticism is there are no historians. Victor is an obvious exception that they miss, and that it's a quote unquote political document, not a work of scholarship. Is there an analog here? I mean, you talked about progressivism and its rejection of rights, but one of the themes of progressivism is that we need to be ruled administratively through the bureaucracy with experts doing disinterested public policy. And I was just struck by the parallel here, because the criticism seems to be, no one said this way explicitly, but of the report is you didn't assemble a bunch of experts. It's not an objective document. It's just a mere political document.
Right.
And that seems to me to speak volumes of how we approach political knowledge, justice, and everything else between right and left.
It's a hackneyed document, as someone said of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
I would say a couple of things, and I want to hear what Charles thinks about this. But one thing I want to point out is I mentioned earlier that we're going to have a book edition with footnotes. And, we've got great stuff. I mean, Gordon Wood and Sean Wilentz and Don Fehrenbacher. I mean, the point here is not that there aren't great historians, great academic professional historians on this side. I think this is the dominant opinion. But I think the larger point is that this document was not written for professional historians. Mm-hmm. This was written for the American people, for the general reader, because at the end of the day, the question is really to them. Do they hold these things to be true? What do they understand about their own history and who they are as a people? And that's who we're writing to. And so it is a public document. It's a document which we have confidence in its points about history. We're going to add our own the footnotes and show that, but that was not the main objective. This was to put a political marker down, if you will, in the public debate.
Right.
And it's not a debate among experts and academics. It's a debate in the political square, in the public square, about who we are. And that's what we're more interested in.
Well, there are no historians on the 1619 project either. So we were simply paying the New York Times a compliment. We figured they had shown that historians have made themselves unnecessary and useless to any public discussion of important public issues today. I can't imagine why they think that's we were in error and they were correct in so excluding professional historians.
You're an academic journalist.
Sorry, what was that?
I said you're both an academic and a journalist.
Yes, on my better days, I am. That's true. When I can multitask.
Yeah, the criticism of it as political, which you did a fine job refuting, I think, Matt, gets to this, the progressive notion and now the modern left's notion, complete with identity politics and everything else, that expertise and rationality and science is on one side and then politics is on the other. And this notion has roots going back to the progressive movement in the late 19th century and Woodrow Wilson and others. And it's yet another source of our deep division, which has been shown with particular poignancy and often tragedy in this whole COVID business. And we'll hear a lot about this, the notion of facts, and as Charles pointed out at the beginning, the notion of facts and science versus politics. And whereas we think true political arguments engage the citizenry as citizens, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it's really the spirit of the Declaration and the Constitution originally. You didn't need to be an expert in history or anything else to understand the principles of your government and how it tries to safeguard them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, besides, the postmodern position is there's no such thing as facts.
Right.
It's politics all the way down.
Yeah.
Politics understood as power, and nothing more than power ultimately. And so, this is it's a nostalgic kind of progressivism that's being indulged by the other side temporarily. But I do want to pick up on something that the executive director mentioned in his wisdom there, which I think is really true and important, and we ought to emphasize a little bit. The extreme elevation of slavery into a virtual principle of America, into a pillar of American freedom that the 1619 people were toying with, was condemned by virtually every leading liberal historian of the period. James McPherson, Gordon Wood, many others wrote publicly in criticism of the New York Times and the 1619 project. And on the general issues of the 1776 Commission report, if you could change the R of President Trump to a D, you might have found that many more very respectable academic historians these days might have endorsed the 1776 Commission report, because they too, they know that there is a problem with the tendentious interpretations that the New York Times has been circulating, the arguments of the 1619 Commission and so forth. And one could take a certain kind of, and we should, I think, take a certain kind of good cheer and even optimism from the fact that this really isn't necessarily a left-right question. There are some very good liberal historians who are also interested in America and in civic education, who have the same views that we do, or at least are open to the views that we have about the universality of all men are created equal and the importance of natural rights and the fight against slavery and the fight to abolish it. All of that is not as hackneyed and as right-wing as a lot of the critics of this report would have you believe. If we're ever going to have any unity, if we're going to move towards greater unity, it seems to me we ought to be thinking about how to reach out to those historians on the left with whom we share quite a few common propositions.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. But of course, that kind of brings us full circle, which is that's exactly why they had to get rid of this report. So to advance an equity agenda, it had to disappear, but also it serves the political purpose, which is unfortunate, that these arguments are now criticized precisely because they are right-wing, also racist, but also just they're trying to pigeonhole it in a much smaller box. I mean, Charles, I don't know about you, but I mean, it wasn't that many years ago. There really is nothing controversial in this report. I mean, they think that it kind of gets into the back and forth about what is identity politics. In an appendix, by the way, which I note ends with a question mark, created equal or identity politics question mark. But generally speaking, the body of the report, there's nothing controversial here that would not be widely accepted, both on the right and the left, among a broad swath of mainstream scholars. And my guess is that's generally true to a large extent, or at least an extent enough that we can reach out to those that would agree. And I think that the abolishing this commission under these circumstances underscores that I think that the argument against 1776 is actually a very small and radical minority argument. It's increasingly influential. It's increasingly shaping the opinions of others, but it's the radical, kind of new and radical argument about American history as opposed to this report.
Yeah, I remember in one of the two presidential debates, Biden was Trump was going after critical race theory and all this stuff, and Biden, you wonder how well Biden understands the roots of all of these things, and whether it's really the staff around him pushing a lot of it, because he was kind of incredulous, who knows if this was sincere or not, but his response was, I mean, come on, racial sensitivity training is not racist.
Come on, guys.
Yeah. I think a lot of America doesn't yet understand or grasp, because they have lives to get on with, families to support, the extent of the division that we've been outlining between identity politics and some of these academic fads of group rights and the original founding understanding. So I think, in addition to reaching out to many liberal historians, I think there should be a real resource to be had in the common sense of the American people on this question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and critics of identity politics are on the left as well as on the right. This isn't just a right-wing thing. I mean, if you think of Mark Lilla, a liberal in very good standing, a Democrat in good standing, who wrote quite a good book called The Once and Future Liberal after the 2016 election, attacking what he thought was the very bad influence of identity politics on the Democratic Party and on and by implication on America. And if you go back a couple of decades before that, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., than whom there is no more impeccable liberal in his context.
Disuniting America, I think, was his book.
Right, wrote the Disuniting of America, one of the very first books by an eminent historian. He even had a PhD in history. I believe it might even have been from Harvard. I'm not sure. From Harvard University, in which he made this argument well in advance of our making. Well, I don't know about that, but well in advance of the current controversies about this kind of. It wasn't called identity politics yet, or he didn't call it that, but multiculturalism, this emphasis on what we don't have in common rather than what we have in common, was going to be very bad for thriving, multi-variant kind of teeming liberal democracy like the United States. And he was right, and Mark Lilla is right, but no one on the left listens to them.
Right. In fact, Lilla got denounced from many fronts on the left for the original essay and then the book as well.
That's right.
Yeah. We have 10 minutes or so left. I wanted to finish with this question of populism, which is on everyone's mind a lot these days, and after Trump's election and now defeat, the status of populism. There have been many critics on the right of Trumpian populism, and I don't mean to tie it directly to the claims in the report, but it's interesting. Two arguments are made, one at the beginning of the opening section of the report, and then emphasized at close to the close of the opening section. And the first point is that in America, sovereignty is with the people. And so in that sense, the people were created, though they pre-existed the Declaration. They were created July 4th, 1776, with this public declaration of causes for separation. And then, of course, winning the war was essential in setting up our own form of government. And then at the end, I think it's interesting to talk about that, because there have been critics on the right and the left over the years that notion is incorrect, that this was really just a union of the states, that the states are sovereign. That's more of an argument on the right. And so it's good to lay down this marker for the creation of the American people in a political sense. And then at the end of this opening section, section 5 of the opening section is called The Task of National Renewal. And this quote appears in the report at home, and it's part of the call for schools and civic education to reject identity politics and this divisive notion of thinking about America. And the quote is, "At home, in school, at the workplace, and in the world, it is the people and only the people who have the power to stand up for America and defend our way of life." How should we think about populism and American government and American notions of justice, Charles? Small question.
Well, that's a big question. Yeah. I mean, populism is it's hard. What populism means is the question. I mean, it's hard to pin the tail on that donkey. When you call populist everyone from Marine Le Pen to Jack Kemp in America, you're using a category that is so broad it has no meaning. Donald Trump, I don't think ever calls himself a populist. Certainly not in any prominent place. It's not a word he actually uses.
Yeah.
Certainly not very much. He has called himself a nationalist once or twice, but I don't think he's ever really called himself a populist, nor has he called his movement a populist movement per se. So to academics today, populism has a bad odor because it is associated with what they call authoritarian populism, which means the kind of populist movement that is anti-rule of law and anti-individual rights. And there are such illiberal populist movements. There are such anti-constitutional populist movements. But I don't think, but show me one. Show me the one in America that is so concerning. I mean, there are fringe, militia groups and things like that, which I agree are potentially dangerous and have to be watched. But we're not talking about a major political movement like Trump's movement, or we shouldn't be talking about it in the same breath as those kinds of things. And the Tea Party movement, which was the precursor, you might say, of Trump's movement, was pro-constitutionalist. These are populists who are also constitutionalists. And I think properly understood, that's true of Trump's movement as well. So and that's the defensible, that's the good kind. That's the moral kind of populism that also is concerned about rights and rule of law, but is exercised about the unelected government, about the so-called experts who increasingly make the law in this country, since most of our laws are made by regulators, not by legislators. So that's a thumbnail sketch of sort of where the debate is right now. But I'll hand it over to Matthew to take that question home.
No, that was very good. I would just put it to put it in terms of the report, which again, I don't think this is a controversial point at all. America is by nature a populist regime in the broad sense that Charles was meaning, right? I mean, it's not a monarchy. It's not an aristocracy. It's a regime in which sovereignty rests with the people, and legitimacy comes from consent out of the principles of the Declaration. So in that sense, we're all populists now. The question is what kind of populism? And I think the real divide here, which Charles was clearly alluding to, at least in American politics, are populists of, I set aside the kind of the more newer versions that are problematic that the elites, the academics want to point to. But generally speaking, right, you have populists like, in a way, Reagan was a populist. He clearly appealed to popular opinion in order to go back to some semblance of a conservatism grounded in these principles, the principles of the founding. Well, that's in that way. There's a long tradition of populism of that ilk, but also FDR, when you think about it, was a populist as well. The modern liberalism were populists, but their populism is a very different thing, which tends to claim to be populist in the way the progressives were representative of the people. But it's also a claim that their populism should lead to a government that reflects the popular will, not necessarily their consent, but the will as they understand it, and lead them forward into some future. So I think it's correct that the debate in America really is a debate about populism, but it's more importantly, what are the principles that inform your populism? And I think our argument is that by the nature of America, a true American populism must be grounded on an understanding of those core principles. What gives legitimacy to popular opinion? What gives rise to it? But equality out of the Declaration of Independence. And that's the populism I think we want to point to, which is ought to be, and for a long time was, the populism, despite our disagreements and policy divides and divisions of opinion. That's what American populism meant. And we argued around the edges about where it should go and how to best reflect it and those kind of things. But we kind of held that in common because of the principles behind it. And I think that's what that's what the report wants to point us back to. How do you have a politics of populism? And we're a popular government, but it's got to be grounded in the core principle of populism, which is consent and human equality.
But I think one, maybe to connect to the subject just before this one, I mean, there is you could say the disagreement in our politics is whether which is the sounder part of the American Republic, the people in general, or the ruling class. That is the people who get the PhDs, who teach in the universities, who run the major agencies and bureaus of the federal government and of the state governments to some extent, and of the cultural sort of hierarchy in the country. And there, I think you do find a real difference of opinion. I mean, Republicans and a certain part of the left even thinks that the people are in better shape than their rulers are. And if you're going to have any kind of sort of renewal of patriotic American democracy, it's going to be sort of from the bottom up. And then the other party thinks, I think, increasingly that the people is dangerous. The people is a standing majority faction. And we call this white supremacy, or there are many other terms, actually, that could be synonyms that could be used for it. But there's a permanent sort of moral derangement in the majority that has to be watched very carefully to make sure that their influence in the government is limited and controlled. And one way to do this is precisely is where identity politics comes in, the subject we were discussing just before, populism. If you break up the majority into, or you break up the people at large into small fractions of themselves, into identity groups, it is easier for the government to manage the people if they are divided and can be administratively looked after as a series of somewhat competitive factions, by race, by ethnicity, by gender orientation, and the even more creative ways they've come up with to divide the American people. And what you don't want to do is let the people coalesce and exert influence as a body on the government. That is very dangerous. And that's why elections have to be watched very carefully, too. You have to be sure that the constituent groups are represented in the election in the way they should be represented. Because if they're not, then you're going to have this problem of majority faction or tyranny of the majority, of the white supremacist majority, if you want to use that newfangled formulation for it. It used to be called the plutocrats, but obviously the majority can't be that plutocratic, since most of the plutocrats vote Democrat these days. But that, I think, is the kind of healthy populism that Matt is talking about, and that the report is invoking.
Yeah,
consent of the governed.
Right. Yeah, consent of the governed, and the deliberation over and then execution of laws that respect individual rights and minority rights in the older sense, rather than the group rights sense of modern identity politics. Well, thank you, Charles and Matt. Matt, you've mentioned that this is going to appear in book form with more citations and all the like. Do we have a timeline on the release of the book or its production?
It's already up on Amazon, or will be very quickly, and it'll be in print in the next few weeks, and in mid-March, it'll be out and about.
Oh, excellent. And I know Hillsdale is going to do a series of events around it, including around the country. So everyone should keep an eye out for that. And we hope to maybe partner on a couple out west or whatever. But
I think the commission will, in some form, continue its work.
Yeah.
Because we really have to. It's not that this is a strange argument. This is really the argument that Claremont and Hillsdale and Dr. Kesler, especially since he's getting old now, but many of us have spent years and years of our lives.
But the author of this outstanding book,
working on. So these principles aren't going away, and so this will definitely continue.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your sprint to the finish on the commission, and I'm sure it was a lot of hard work. And thanks to you both for all you do, and for your friendship and work at Claremont and at Hillsdale.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Commissioner Kesler.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.